A brand new 115 horsepower outboard from a Chinese manufacturer costs $3,800. The American equivalent? $14,000. That's not a sale price. That's not refurbished. And no, it's not a typo. The math is in writing, the engines are on the water, and the gap keeps widening. But here's what nobody's asking. If the price is 70% lower, what actually got cheaper? Because I'm going to show you it's not what you think. Most people assume the answer is quality, thinner metal, skipped steps, loose tolerances. And sure, that makes sense if you've never seen how these things are actually made. But walk into one of the major production facilities in Suzhou or Chongqing, and the first thing you notice isn't what's missing, it's what's duplicated. Rows of CNC machines running identical programs, castings pulled from the same molds going into 6 different engine families, assembly lines where the same crankshaft gets branded 3 different ways before it leaves the building. This isn't corner cutting, it's cost distribution at a scale Western manufacturers abandoned 30 years ago. Here's the twist. The savings don't come from making bad parts, they come from making the same part 10 million times. Let me walk you through what that actually looks like. In a typical Chinese outboard factory, you'll see a single forge producing cylinder blocks for what appears to be 4 competing brands. Same alloy, same dimensions, same QC station at the end of the line. The only difference is which logo gets bolted on during final assembly. To a Western engineer, that looks like cheating. To a production accountant, it's the only way the numbers work. Because when you're stamping out 50,000 blocks a month instead of 5,000, your cost per unit doesn't drop 10%, it drops 60%. Now here's where people get it wrong. They assume Chinese factories skip expensive processes to save money, but tooling, the actual machines that cut, forge, and finish metal, is more expensive in China than it used to be. Automation costs have climbed, skilled machinists cost more than they did a decade ago. So how does the price keep falling? The answer is amortization. If a single CNC mill costs $2 million and you run 50 units through it, each one carries $40,000 of tooling cost. Run 50,000 units through it, and that cost drops to $40. Same machine, same precision. The only thing that changed is volume. Don't click off, because this is where people get trapped. Because the assumption is that volume equals compromise. More units means lower standards, right? Except in high-volume manufacturing, the opposite is often true. When you're making the same thing 1,000,000 times, variation becomes your enemy. A tolerance drift that costs you 0.02 millimeters per part becomes a $20,000 scrap pile by Thursday. So Chinese factories running these kinds of numbers don't relax their QC, they automate it. Laser measurement, automated go-no-go gauges, digital torque verification on every fastener. Not because they care more about quality, because at that scale, caring is cheaper than fixing. But here's the part no one tells you. All that automation creates a trade-off you won't see on the spec sheet. Picture a quality control checkpoint in one of these facilities. An engine block comes off the line, gets scanned by 3 different sensors, and either continues to assembly or gets flagged for rejection. No human decision, no judgment call. If it's within tolerance, it moves. If it's not, it stops. That sounds good until you realize what it eliminates. The experienced technician who can tell you why a part failed. The guy who notices a pattern in the scrap bin and traces it back to a worn tool before it becomes a batch problem. Automation catches defects. It doesn't catch deterioration. And that gap shows up later, not in the factory, but in the field. Let me show you what that looks like downstream. A boat owner in Florida buys a Chinese outboard, runs it for 18 months. No problems. Then one day, the lower unit starts whining. He pulls it, finds the bearings are pitted, takes it to a dealer. The dealer orders the part, gets it in 4 days, swaps it out. Total downtime, a week. The owner's annoyed, but it's fixable. Now rewind that same scenario with a Western outboard from the 1990s. Same bearing failure, same dealer, except this time the part's been discontinued. The replacement is a service assembly that costs 3 times what the bearing cost and requires pulling the entire gear case. Downtime? 3 weeks. And the owner starts wondering if he should have just bought new. Here's the question nobody's asking. Which one of those failures was actually worse? Because Chinese manufacturers aren't just competing on price, they're competing on parts availability. When you're producing components at the volume they are, keeping inventory isn't a burden, it's a rounding error. A Western manufacturer discontinues a part because warehousing 10,000 units for a model they sold 8,000 of doesn't make financial sense. A Chinese manufacturer keeps making that same part because their sister brand still uses it, and their supplier needs the volume anyway. The engine might be cheaper, but the part that keeps it running stays available longer. Now watch what happens when you flip that lens around. If you're a dealer in the US or Europe, your entire business model is built on service margin, parts markup, labor hours, warranty administration. You stock $200,000 of inventory because customers expect same-day turnaround. Then a Chinese brand shows up and says, "We'll ship any part in 72 hours. Direct, no minimum order." Suddenly, your parts counter isn't an asset, it's a liability. And your service bay? That's now competing with YouTube tutorials and a $10 torque wrench. This is the trade-off you don't see on the dealer floor. Cheap engines don't ruin people. Fragile systems do. Let's talk about what doesn't get cheaper. Metallurgy, combustion engineering, bearing tolerances. These aren't negotiable if you want the thing to run. A piston still has to seal. A crankshaft still has to balance. Fuel still has to atomize at the right moment. Chinese manufacturers didn't figure out how to skip those steps. They figured out how to do them at a different cost structure. And the way they did it is by collapsing the supply chain. Here's how that works. A Western outboard might source its pistons from Germany, its electronics from Japan, its castings from Mexico, and assemble everything in Wisconsin. Each handoff adds cost: shipping, tariffs, coordination, inventory buffer. By the time the engine reaches a dealer, it's carrying the weight of 5 different margin stacks. A Chinese manufacturer builds the whole thing within a 100-kilometer radius. Same industrial park, same logistics network, same suppliers feeding 6 different assembly plants. The piston forgings come from the factory next door. The wiring harnesses are made 2 buildings over. There's no intercontinental shipping, no customs paperwork, no buffer stock sitting in a warehouse in Long Beach. We'll come back to why this matters later, but first you need to understand what it costs to build the opposite kind of system. Imagine you're running an outboard company in the US. You want to launch a new model. You need tooling, suppliers, testing, certification. You spread that cost across projected sales, let's say 20,000 units over 5 years. Your break-even is somewhere north of unit 15,000. If the model flops, you're underwater. If it succeeds, you're profitable in year 4. Now imagine you're in China. You're launching the same model, but your domestic market alone is 300,000 units. You break even at unit 8,000. By year 2, you're profitable. And here's the kicker. Everything you sell for export, that's gravy. You're not pricing to recover development cost, you're pricing to move surplus capacity. That's not dumping, that's just maths. But here's the real problem. When your competitor's export pricing is based on surplus recovery and yours is based on cost recovery, you're not in the same game anymore. You're playing Monopoly, they're playing chess, and the rules don't reconcile. This is where the stakes escalate, because it's not just about who makes a cheaper engine, it's about who controls the industrial capacity to make any engine at all. Right now, the supply chain for small power plant manufacturing is concentrating in a handful of regions, mostly Asia, mostly China. The castings, the electronics, the precision machining, it's all moving to where volume lives, and volume lives where the domestic market is big enough to justify the infrastructure. If you're a Western manufacturer, you're not just competing with Chinese brands, you're competing with the fact that the foundry you used to rely on now prioritizes customers who order in container loads, not pallets. Here's the part no one tells you. Reshoring doesn't solve this, not unless you're willing to rebuild the supplier network too. And that doesn't happen in 5 years, it happens in 20. Let me give you a human-scale example of what this looks like in practice. There's a QC engineer in Wenzhou and works for one of the mid-tier outboard manufacturers. His job is to run random pulls off the assembly line, grab an engine every 50th unit, bolt it to a test stand, run it through a 30-minute cycle. Load, no load, thermal stress, vibration check. If it passes, it gets crated. If it fails, the whole batch gets flagged. He's been doing this for 6 years. I asked him what the fail rate was. He said it used to be around 3%. Now it's under 1. Not because the designs got better, because the machines got better, the tooling got better, the process control got tighter. His job didn't get easier, it got boring. And boring in manufacturing is exactly what you want. Now, contrast that with a service bay I visited in North Carolina. The lead tech there has been working on outboards for 30 years, mostly Japanese and American brands. I asked him what he thought about the Chinese engines coming in. He said the engines themselves were fine, simple, easy to work on. The problem was the owners. Half of them had never changed oil in their lives, didn't know you were supposed to flush salt water, ran them hard, stored them wet, then blamed the manufacturer when corrosion ate the impeller. He said the engine wasn't the failure point, the operator was, and no amount of engineering fixes ignorance. That's the hidden variable. Ownership competence. Chinese manufacturers are designing for a market where service infrastructure is thin and operator knowledge is inconsistent. That means simpler layouts, fewer proprietary tools, maintenance intervals that assume neglect. It's not that they're building worse engines, they're building engines for worse conditions. And when you drop one of those into a Western market where people expect things to just work without reading the manual, you get a mismatch. Not in quality, in expectation. This is where the savings actually come from, not from skipping steps, from designing around the steps people skip anyway. Let's zoom out. What does all this mean for someone trying to decide what to bolt on their transom? The price gap is real. The performance gap is closing. The parts availability might actually be better, but the service network is thinner. The resale value is unknown, and the long-term durability is still a question mark, because the engines haven't been in the field long enough to generate 20-year data. You're not choosing between good and bad, you're choosing between proven and efficient. Here's where the danger sets. If you're the kind of owner who runs your engine hard, maintains it religiously, and plans to keep the boat for 15 years, the calculus is different than if you're flipping every 3 years and care more about monthly payment than residual value. A cheap engine with good parts support might outlast an expensive engine with discontinued parts. Or it might not. The answer depends on your usage model, your technical ability, and your tolerance for uncertainty. But here's the final twist. The question isn't whether Chinese outboards are good enough. It's whether the systems built around Western outboards can survive the pricing pressure. Because when a dealer's parts margin evaporates and their service base sits empty, it doesn't matter how good the engine is. If you can't get it fixed, it's worthless. And if the manufacturer that built it goes under because they can't compete, your warranty becomes war alert. The real question isn't how they build engines this cheap. It's whether your ownership model is built to survive it. The factories will keep running, the prices will keep falling, and the gap between what you pay and what you get will keep tightening until one side blinks. Make sure you're ready when they do.